The autumn rain drummed against the funeral home windows as Sarah Chun stood beside her husband's casket, her hands trembling as she clutched a single white lily. David had been gone for 3 days now, his heart giving out at 52 without warning, and she still couldn't believe she would never hear his laugh again. The viewing room filled with the scent of flowers and hushed conversations, but Sarah felt completely alone in her grief. She had barely slept since that terrible morning when she found him collapsed in their kitchen, still wearing the blue tie she had straightened for him just hours before. Now, watching friends and colleagues pay their respects, Sarah wondered how she would possibly move forward without the man who had been her anchor for 15 years. Where are you watching from today? Whether you're dealing with loss in your own family or simply witnessing this story unfold, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your location, because stories like these remind us that family drama knows no borders. Richard Blackwood and his wife Margaret swept into the funeral home like they owned the place, their designer black clothing and expensive jewelry announcing their presence before they even spoke. David's older brother had always carried himself with the arrogance of someone born into old money, though David had often mentioned that Richard's trust fund had been depleted years ago through bad investments and lavish spending. Richard approached Sarah with the practiced sympathy of someone going through the motions. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Sarah," he said, his voice carrying just enough emotion to sound appropriate. Margaret stood beside him, her lips pursed in what might have been an attempt at a compassionate expression, though her eyes remained cold and calculating. "Thank you for coming," Sarah replied softly, her accent still faintly noticeable after all these years in America. "It means so much that you're here for David." Margaret's gaze swept over Sarah's simple black dress, her nose wrinkling slightly, as if she had detected something unpleasant. "Of course we're here, dear. David was family. Blood family." The emphasis on blood hung in the air like a threat, though Sarah was too exhausted by grief to fully process its implications. As mourners continued to arrive, Richard and Margaret positioned themselves near the guest book, greeting David's business associates and construction industry contacts with the familiarity of people who considered themselves the rightful heirs to his legacy. They spoke in hushed tones about David's brilliance, his vision, his incredible success in building a construction empire from nothing. He was always the smart one, Richard told a group of contractors who had worked with David for years. Even as kids, you could tell David was destined for greatness. Had this incredible mind for business, could see opportunities where others saw problems. That's how he built Pinnacle Construction into what it became. Margaret nodded along, adding her own embellishments to the narrative. David was so driven, so focused. He used to tell us about his plans, how he was going to revolutionize the construction industry in this city. And look what he accomplished. $50 million in assets, projects all over the state. Not bad for a boy from our little family. Sarah listened to these conversations from across the room, her grief mixing with confusion. The David they described sounded like someone she barely knew. Her husband had been passionate about construction, certainly, but he had always been humble about his success, quick to share credit with his team and especially with her. The way Richard and Margaret spoke made it sound like David had been some kind of singular genius, building everything through pure force of will and intellect. As the evening wore on, Sarah began to notice how Richard and Margaret seemed to be holding court, accepting condolences as if they were the primary mourners. When David's longtime foreman approached Sarah to share memories of working alongside her husband, Margaret quickly inserted herself into the conversation. "David was always so hands-on with the technical aspects," Margaret said, though Sarah knew for a fact that David had relied heavily on his engineering team for complex technical decisions. He had this gift for seeing the big picture while also understanding every detail of the construction process. It's what made him so successful. The foreman looked confused. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, David always said that Sarah was the one who really understood the engineering side of things. He used to joke that she could design a skyscraper in her sleep." Margaret's smile never wavered, but her voice took on a sharper edge. "Oh, I'm sure Sarah was very supportive. David was always so generous in sharing credit. But of course, the real vision, the business acumen, that all came from David. It's in the Blackwood blood, you know." Sarah felt a flush of anger at hearing her contributions dismissed so casually, but she was too drained to argue. Instead, she excused herself and found refuge in the funeral home's small garden, where she could process her emotions away from the crowd. She was still outside when Richard found her 20 minutes later, his demeanor noticeably different now that they were alone. "Sarah, we need to talk about practical matters," he said without preamble. "I know this isn't the ideal time, but there are business considerations that can't wait." Sarah looked up at him, surprised by his directness. "What kind of considerations?" Richard sat down beside her on the garden bench, though his posture remained stiff and formal. David built something remarkable with Pinnacle Construction, something that represents not just his individual effort, but the legacy of the entire Blackwood family. "Our father started with a small contracting business, you know? David took those family roots and turned them into an empire." Sarah frowned, trying to follow his logic. David rarely spoke about his father's business. He always said he started Pinnacle from scratch. "Well, yes, technically he did start fresh," Richard conceded quickly. "But the point is, this success represents generations of Blackwood entrepreneurship and vision. It's something that needs to be preserved for the family legacy." The implication in his words was becoming clearer, and Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. "What exactly are you suggesting, Richard?" Margaret appeared from the shadows, as if she had been waiting for the right moment to join the conversation. "What Richard is trying to say, dear, is that we all need to think about what David would have wanted for his life's work. He built this company for the Blackwood family, not just for personal gain." Sarah's exhaustion was giving way to sharp alertness as she realized what was happening. "Are you suggesting that David's business doesn't belong to his wife?" Richard's practiced sympathy was fading, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "Sarah, please don't misunderstand. We're not questioning your right to inherit. But surely you can see that a business worth $50 million requires proper management, proper understanding of the industry, proper connections. David spent his whole life building relationships in this city, understanding the construction market, developing the expertise needed to run a company like Pinnacle. And you think I lack those qualifications?" Sarah asked quietly. Margaret reached over and patted Sarah's hand in a gesture that felt more condescending than comforting. "Oh, sweetheart, it's not about qualifications. It's about understanding that David's success came from being a Blackwood, from having generations of business instinct in his blood. You're a lovely person, truly, but you have to admit that managing a $50 million construction company requires more than just being married to the founder." Richard nodded along with his wife's assessment. "The construction industry is incredibly complex, Sarah. It requires relationships that took David decades to build, knowledge of local regulations and customs that you simply couldn't have as someone who didn't grow up here. We're not trying to cut you out, but we think the responsible thing would be to ensure the business remains under family control." Sarah stood up slowly, her grief beginning to transform into something sharper and more focused. "And by family control, you mean your control?" "Well, naturally," Richard said, as if it should be obvious. "Margaret and I have been involved in David's business decisions for years. We understand the industry, we have the connections, we have the Blackwood name that opens doors in this city. The responsible thing would be to transition the business to proper family management while ensuring you're well provided for." Margaret smiled the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "We're talking about a generous settlement, dear. Enough to ensure you're comfortable for the rest of your life. But the business itself, that needs to stay in the family where it belongs." Sarah looked at these two people who had barely spoken to her in the 15 years she had been married to their brother, who had dismissed her contributions to David's success, who were now suggesting she was unfit to inherit her own husband's legacy. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet but steady. "I see. And what makes you think David would have wanted that?" Richard's confident demeanor suggested he had been anticipating this question. "Because David was a Blackwood, Sarah. Because he understood family loyalty and family legacy. Because he knew that building something lasting means ensuring it stays in the hands of people who understand its true value and significance." As they walked back toward the funeral home, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. The overwhelming grief was still there, but it was now accompanied by a crystal-clear understanding of what she was facing. These people saw her as an obstacle to claiming what they believed was rightfully theirs. They had spent the entire evening rewriting David's story to position themselves as the rightful heirs to his success. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that their carefully constructed narrative was built on foundations as unstable as sand. And Sarah Chun was about to show them exactly how unstable those foundations really were. 3 weeks after David's funeral, Sarah was still processing her grief when the legal papers arrived. The process server handed her a thick envelope at her front door, his apologetic expression suggesting he understood the weight of what he was delivering. Inside, she found a formal contest to David's will, filed by Richard and Margaret Blackwood, demanding their rightful share of what they claimed was the family construction business. The lawsuit alleged that David had been unduly influenced by his foreign wife, that the marriage had been entered into under false pretenses for immigration purposes, and that the true ownership of Pinnacle Construction belonged to the Blackwood family estate. Sarah read the legal language with growing disbelief, each accusation more outrageous than the last. Richard and Margaret had hired Thomas Whitfield, the most expensive probate attorney in the city. Whitfield's firm occupied 3 floors of the downtown financial district, and his reputation for ruthless litigation was legendary among the wealthy families who could afford his services. Within days of filing the lawsuit, Whitfield was giving interviews to local business journals about the case. This is really about protecting family legacy from predatory marriage schemes, Whitfield told the Business Tribune reporter, his silver hair and expensive suit lending gravitas to his words. David Blackwood built a $50 million construction empire through decades of hard work, industry expertise, and family business acumen. It would be tragic to see that legacy dismantled because of a relationship that was clearly entered into for financial gain rather than genuine affection. The article painted Sarah as a calculating immigrant who had seduced a successful American businessman, citing anonymous family sources who claimed the marriage had been troubled from the beginning. Richard was quoted extensively, sharing carefully crafted memories of his brother's business genius. David was always the visionary in our family, Richard told the reporter. Even as children, he could see opportunities where others saw obstacles. When he started Pinnacle Construction, I remember him staying up nights working on business plans, studying market trends, developing the innovative approaches that would make him so successful. It's heartbreaking to think that someone might profit from his hard work without having contributed anything meaningful to his success. Margaret was equally quotable, describing David as a devoted family member who had always prioritized Blackwood family interests. David understood that business success creates responsibilities to family legacy, she explained to the local newspaper's society page. He knew that what he built belonged not just to him, but to future generations of Blackwoods. That's why this lawsuit is so important. We're not fighting for money. We're fighting to preserve what David really cared about. The media coverage was devastating for Sarah's reputation in the tight-knit construction industry. Contractors who had worked with David for years began avoiding her calls, uncertain about the legal situation surrounding Pinnacle Construction. Several ongoing projects were put on hold as clients worried about potential ownership disputes affecting their timelines and budgets. Sarah's grief counselor recommended that she hire legal representation immediately, but Sarah's modest savings were nothing compared to the Whitfield firm's resources. She eventually found Maria Rodriguez, a solo practitioner who specialized in probate disputes and had a reputation for taking on powerful opponents despite limited resources. Maria's small office above a coffee shop was a stark contrast to Whitfield's downtown tower, but her credentials from the State University Law School were solid, and her passion for defending underdogs was obvious. David's extended family rallied around Richard and Margaret with enthusiastic support for the lawsuit. Cousins who had barely spoken to David in recent years suddenly emerged with detailed memories of his business brilliance and family loyalty. At family gatherings, they shared stories of David's entrepreneurial genius that seemed to grow more elaborate with each telling. David's cousin Patricia told anyone who would listen about the time teenage David had organized a neighborhood landscaping business, turning it into a profitable summer venture through pure innovation and leadership skills. Another cousin, Michael, recalled David's college years when he had supposedly developed revolutionary construction techniques during his engineering studies, though Sarah knew David had actually studied business administration with mediocre grades. These family stories began appearing in Whitfield's legal briefs as evidence of David's innate business capabilities and deep family connections to the construction industry. The narrative being constructed portrayed David as a construction prodigy who had transformed family entrepreneurial DNA into a modern business empire, with Sarah cast as an opportunistic outsider who had manipulated her way into an undeserved inheritance. The legal discovery process began with Whitfield's team demanding immediate access to all Pinnacle construction records, financial statements, and business correspondence. They requested David's personal files, computer records, and even his private communications with Sarah, claiming that evidence of undue influence might be found in their personal relationship dynamics. Sarah felt violated by the intrusion into her most private memories with David, but Maria advised her that cooperation was legally required. As boxes of documents were turned over to Whitfield's investigators, Sarah watched strangers rifling through the life she and David had built together, looking for ammunition to use against her. Whitfield's public statements grew more aggressive as the discovery process continued. In a television interview, he suggested that Sarah's immigration status had been the primary motivation for the marriage, pointing to the timing of their wedding just months before David's business began its most profitable phase. The pattern is quite clear when you examine the timeline, Whitfield explained to the news anchor. This marriage coincides exactly with David Blackwood's breakthrough success in the construction industry. It's hardly coincidental that someone would attach themselves to a rising business star just as his empire was taking off. The Blackwood family has every right to question whether this relationship was genuine or simply a calculated business arrangement. Margaret appeared alongside Whitfield in several interviews, presenting herself as the grieving sister-in-law who only wanted to protect David's memory and legacy. She spoke about David's dedication to family values and his pride in the Blackwood name, painting Sarah as someone who had never truly understood or appreciated these deeper family connections. David used to tell us how lonely he felt sometimes, Margaret confided to a sympathetic interviewer. He was so focused on building his business that he didn't always take time for personal relationships. I think that vulnerability made him susceptible to someone who seemed to offer companionship but was really interested in the financial security he could provide. Richard took a more aggressive approach in his media appearances, directly challenging Sarah's fitness to manage a complex business operation. The construction industry requires decades of experience, deep local relationships, and sophisticated understanding of market dynamics, he explained to the Business Journal. David spent his entire adult life developing these capabilities. It's unrealistic to expect someone without that background to successfully continue what he built. The family's public relations campaign was remarkably coordinated, with different relatives appearing on local news programs and in newspaper interviews, all reinforcing the same themes about David's genius, family loyalty, and Sarah's unsuitability as his heir. They portrayed themselves as reluctant litigants, forced into legal action to protect David's legacy from someone who couldn't possibly understand its true value. As the weeks passed, Sarah found herself increasingly isolated in her own community. Former friends grew distant, uncertain about the swirling legal and media controversy. Business associates stopped returning her calls, worried about being drawn into the ugly family dispute. Even David's longtime secretary, someone Sarah had considered an ally, began treating her with cool professionalism rather than the warmth they had shared during David's lifetime. Sarah's daily routine became a careful navigation of public spaces where she might encounter hostile stares or whispered conversations about the lawsuit. The grocery store, the bank, even the coffee shop where she had once felt comfortable became potential minefields of judgment and speculation about her motives and character. Through it all, Sarah maintained the quiet dignity that had always been her nature, but the strain was visible in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. She attended every legal meeting with Maria, answered every invasive question from Whitfield's investigators, and endured every humiliating media attack without public complaint. What Richard and Margaret didn't realize was that their aggressive campaign was creating a detailed record of their assumptions and accusations, assumptions that would soon be tested against a very different set of facts than the ones they had chosen to believe. Their confident public statements about David's genius and their own understanding of his business success were about to be measured against evidence they had never bothered to examine. Sarah's apparent helplessness in the face of their legal and media assault was real enough, but it masked a deep reservoir of knowledge and strength that the Blackwood family had never taken the time to discover. As they celebrated their early victories in the court of public opinion, they remained completely unaware that they were building their case on a foundation of myths and assumptions that wouldn't survive contact with the actual facts of David's business empire. Maria Rodriguez spread the Pinnacle construction files across her small conference table like a detective examining evidence from a cold case. As David's business records emerged from their boxes, she began to notice patterns that didn't quite match the narrative Richard and Margaret had been selling to the media and the courts. The first inconsistency appeared in the incorporation documents. According to the Blackwood family's version of events, David had been building his construction empire for years before meeting Sarah, drawing on family business expertise and his own entrepreneurial genius. But the paperwork told a different story entirely. Pinnacle Construction had been officially incorporated in March 2009, exactly 6 weeks after Sarah Chun had arrived in the United States on her fiancé visa. The timing wasn't just close, it was precise, as if David had been waiting for something specific before taking the leap into business ownership. Maria called Sarah into her office to discuss this discovery, watching carefully for her client's reaction to questions about the timeline. "Sarah, I need to understand something about when David started his business. The incorporation papers show Pinnacle was founded right after you arrived from Taiwan. Was that coincidental?" Sarah looked uncomfortable, shifting in her chair, as if the question touched on memories she preferred to keep private. "David had been talking about starting his own company for months before I arrived," she said quietly. "He was working for Morrison Construction then, doing project management, but he always dreamed of being his own boss. I guess my arrival gave him the confidence to finally take the risk." Maria made notes, but sensed there was more to the story than Sarah was sharing. The second anomaly appeared in the early business filings, where Sarah's name appeared as a business consultant rather than just David's wife. This detail had been completely absent from the Blackwood family's public statements about the company's founding. "I notice you're listed as a consultant in these early documents," Maria observed. "What kind of consulting work were you doing for Pinnacle in those first months?" Sarah hesitated, her voice growing even quieter. "David said it would be good for the immigration paperwork if I had official work status. I helped with some of the technical aspects, reviewing blueprints and construction specifications. I had studied engineering in Taiwan, so I understood the technical side better than David did." This casual revelation stopped Maria in her tracks. "You studied engineering? What kind of engineering?" "Civil engineering," Sarah replied, as if it were a minor detail rather than a crucial qualification for running a construction company. "I had my degree from National Taiwan University before I came here." David used to joke that I knew more about building foundations than he did. Maria stared at her client, realizing that this engineering background had never been mentioned in any of the legal proceedings. The Blackwood family had been arguing that Sarah lacked the qualifications to run a construction business, while she possessed exactly the technical expertise that David himself had lacked. Sarah's professional background became the focus of Maria's investigation over the following weeks. What she discovered challenged every assumption the opposing counsel had made about her client's capabilities and contributions to Pinnacle's success. Sarah's transcript from National Taiwan University revealed a distinguished academic record in civil engineering, with particular specialization in foundation design and earthquake-resistant construction techniques. Her senior project had won the university's Engineering Innovation Award for developing cost-effective methods to strengthen building foundations in seismically active regions. But Sarah's qualifications went beyond her formal education. Before immigrating to America, she had worked for 3 years at Taiwan's largest construction consulting firm, where she had been involved in major infrastructure projects including highway bridges, commercial buildings, and industrial facilities. Her supervisor's recommendation letter, written in precise English, praised her innovative problem-solving abilities and deep understanding of modern construction methodologies. When Maria asked why Sarah had never mentioned this impressive background, the answer revealed something troubling about the dynamics in her marriage to David. He said American clients would be more comfortable working with him as the face of the business, Sarah explained. He thought my accent and my being foreign might make people nervous about trusting us with their projects. So we agreed that he would handle the client relationships while I focused on the technical work behind the scenes. This arrangement had apparently worked well for David's ego and for Pinnacle's bottom line, but it had created the public impression that David was the technical genius behind the company's success. The more Maria dug into the business records, the more she realized how completely this impression misrepresented the actual division of labor at Pinnacle Construction. The company's early project files revealed an interesting pattern that Thomas Whitfield's investigators had apparently missed. Every successful bid, every innovative solution, every technical breakthrough that had established Pinnacle's reputation could be traced back to detailed engineering analyses written in Sarah's precise handwriting, with David's signature appearing only on the final client presentations. One particularly telling example was Pinnacle's Breakthrough Project, a complex commercial development that had required innovative foundation techniques due to challenging soil conditions. The project files contained dozens of pages of technical calculations, soil analysis reports, and engineering drawings, all in Sarah's handwriting, leading to a final presentation that bore only David's name and signature. Maria began interviewing former Pinnacle employees to understand the company's internal operations. What she learned from these conversations painted a picture that was radically different from the Blackwood family's version of David's business genius. Frank Morrison, Pinnacle's longtime project supervisor, was reluctant to speak at first, clearly uncomfortable about discussing his deceased boss in anything less than glowing terms. But when pressed about the technical aspects of Pinnacle's most challenging projects, his answers became revealing. David was great with the clients, no question about it, Frank admitted. He could sell anyone on our capabilities, had this way of making people confident we could handle whatever they needed. But when it came to the actual engineering problems, the tricky foundation work, the complex structural challenges, he always brought those back to Sarah for analysis. Morrison's account was corroborated by other former employees, each adding details that supported the same basic pattern. David handled sales, client relations, and project management, while Sarah solved the technical problems that actually made those projects successful. The dynamic had worked so well that most clients never realized the engineering expertise was coming from the quiet woman who occasionally appeared at project meetings but rarely spoke up during discussions. As Maria continued her investigation, she began uncovering financial records that raised even more serious questions about the Blackwood family's understanding of Pinnacle's origins. The company's initial startup capital hadn't come from David's savings or family resources, as Richard and Margaret had assumed. Instead, the funding had been provided through a complex arrangement involving overseas investments and currency transfers that seemed to originate from Taiwan. "Sarah, I need you to explain these financial records to me," Maria said during one of their meetings. "The initial funding for Pinnacle, where did that money actually come from?" Sarah looked uncomfortable again, her reluctance to discuss financial details clearly rooted in something deeper than mere privacy concerns. "I had some savings from my work in Taiwan," she said carefully, "and I had made some investments in technology companies there that did well. When David wanted to start the business, I was able to help with the initial capital." "How much help are we talking about?" Maria pressed. The question hung in the air for a long moment before Sarah answered. "All of it. The entire initial investment came from my savings and investment profits. David had some debt from his previous business attempts, so he couldn't qualify for business loans. But I had clean credit and the cash available, so we structured it as my investment in his company." This revelation was staggering. The Blackwood family had been arguing that David had built Pinnacle through his own genius and family business acumen, when in reality the company had been entirely funded by Sarah's personal wealth. Their entire legal theory was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how Pinnacle Construction had come into existence. But perhaps the most damning evidence against the Blackwood narrative emerged from David's own personal files, documents that revealed his true feelings about his business partnership with Sarah. His private journals and email correspondence painted a picture of a man who was increasingly aware that his wife's contributions were essential to their success, even as he enjoyed taking public credit for achievements that were largely hers. In one particularly honest journal entry from 2015, David had written about his growing discomfort with the public perception of his role at Pinnacle. "Sometimes I feel like a fraud when people praise my engineering innovations," he had confessed to his diary. "Sarah is the one who actually understands how buildings stay standing. I just know how to convince people to trust us with their projects. Maybe someday I should give her more public credit for what she contributes. But I worry it might hurt our business if clients think the real expertise is coming from someone they see as foreign." These private admissions directly contradicted everything Richard and Margaret had been saying about David's singular genius and Sarah's peripheral role in the business. They also revealed a man who was struggling with the ethical implications of accepting credit for work he hadn't done, though he had apparently never found the courage to correct the public misperception. As Maria compiled this evidence, she began to realize that the Blackwood family's lawsuit wasn't just legally groundless. It was based on a complete fantasy about how Pinnacle Construction had actually operated. Richard and Margaret had constructed an elaborate mythology about their brother's business genius without ever bothering to examine the actual facts of how that business had been built and sustained. Their confidence in challenging Sarah's inheritance was about to collide with a reality they had never bothered to investigate. The woman they dismissed as an unqualified gold digger was actually the technical mastermind and primary financial backer of everything they were trying to claim as David's legacy. But Maria knew that presenting this evidence effectively would require more than just documents and testimony. She needed to demonstrate not just what Sarah had contributed to Pinnacle's success, but how completely the Blackwood family had misunderstood the very foundation of the business they were trying to inherit. Maria's investigation took a dramatic turn when she finally gained access to Sarah's complete academic records from Taiwan. What she discovered was so impressive that she had to verify the documents twice before accepting their implications for the case. Sarah hadn't simply studied civil engineering at National Taiwan University. She had earned a PhD in civil engineering with highest honors, completing her dissertation on innovative foundation systems for high-rise construction in earthquake-prone regions. Her research had been published in international engineering journals and cited by construction professionals across Asia and North America. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me you have a doctorate in engineering?" Maria asked during their next meeting, spreading the translated transcripts across her desk. Sarah looked embarrassed by the question, her hands folding nervously in her lap. "David thought it would be better if people didn't know about my education level. He said American construction workers might be uncomfortable taking direction from someone they saw as overeducated, especially a foreign woman. We decided it was simpler to let people assume I was just his supportive wife." This revelation was staggering. The Blackwood family had been arguing that Sarah lacked the qualifications to run a construction business, while she actually possessed more advanced engineering credentials than most construction company owners could ever dream of achieving. Her PhD dissertation had specifically addressed the kinds of foundation challenges that had made Pinnacle Construction's reputation in the local market. But Sarah's academic achievements were only the beginning of what Maria discovered about her client's background. The financial investigation revealed that Sarah had arrived in America with substantial personal wealth, accumulated through a combination of high-tech investments and consulting work that had made her financially independent long before she ever met David. The money trail led back to Sarah's pre-immigration career in Taiwan's booming technology sector. After completing her PhD, she had worked as a consulting engineer for major construction projects while simultaneously investing in emerging technology companies. Her engineering salary had been substantial, but her investment portfolio had been extraordinary. Sarah had identified and invested early in 3 Taiwanese semiconductor companies that had gone on to become major suppliers to international electronics manufacturers. Her initial investments of modest engineering salary savings had multiplied dramatically as Taiwan's tech industry exploded in the global marketplace. By the time she met David during his business trip to Taiwan, she was already a millionaire in her own right. Maria traced the financial transfers that had funded Pinnacle Construction's startup, discovering that every dollar of initial capital had come from Sarah's personal accounts. David hadn't contributed any money to the business launch because his previous entrepreneurial attempts had left him deeply in debt rather than financially positioned to start a new company. The records showed that David had been working as a struggling real estate agent before meeting Sarah, bouncing between different agencies and rarely earning enough commission to cover his basic living expenses. His credit reports from that period revealed maxed-out credit cards, late payment notices, and a financial profile that would have made business loan approval impossible. Sarah had not only provided all the startup funding for Pinnacle Construction, she had also personally guaranteed the business loans that had funded the company's early expansion. Her excellent credit history and substantial assets had made her the only viable candidate for securing the financing that David needed to bid on larger construction projects. Thomas Whitfield was growing increasingly nervous as Maria's discovery requests forced him to examine evidence that contradicted every assumption his clients had made about the case. The financial records alone were enough to destroy Richard and Margaret's claims about David's self-made success, but the technical documentation was even more damaging to their position. Maria's engineering expert reviewed hundreds of Pinnacle Construction project files, finding a consistent pattern of sophisticated technical analysis written in Sarah's handwriting, followed by simplified client presentations bearing David's signature. The innovative foundation techniques that had established Pinnacle's reputation were documented in detailed engineering reports that clearly demonstrated Sarah's authorship. One particularly revealing example was Pinnacle's most famous project, a 30-story office building that had required groundbreaking foundation work due to challenging underground conditions. The project files contained 47 pages of soil analysis, structural calculations, and engineering drawings, all in Sarah's precise technical writing, leading to a 2-page client summary that David had presented as his own innovative solution. The engineering expert's analysis was devastating for the Blackwood family's case. Every major technical innovation that had driven Pinnacle's success could be traced directly to Sarah's engineering expertise, while David's contributions were limited to client relations and project coordination. The idea that David had been the technical genius behind the company's achievements was completely unsupportable when measured against the actual project documentation. Richard and Margaret began to panic as Whitfield shared the mounting evidence against their position. The confident media statements they had made about David's singular genius and their own understanding of his business success were looking increasingly foolish in light of the documented facts about Sarah's role in the company's operations. Margaret called an emergency family meeting to discuss their deteriorating legal position, her voice tight with stress as she addressed the relatives who had encouraged her to challenge David's will. "This whole situation is more complicated than we realized," she admitted to the gathered cousins and siblings. Apparently, Sarah had more involvement in the business than any of us knew about. Richard was even more direct about their problems, his earlier confidence replaced by growing desperation. "Whitfield is telling us we need to consider settling the case. He says the evidence is not developing the way we expected, and continuing with the lawsuit might expose us to paying Sarah's legal fees on top of our own." The family members who had been so enthusiastic about sharing stories of David's business genius were suddenly much less eager to be associated with the lawsuit. Cousin Patricia, who had testified about David's teenage entrepreneurial brilliance, began questioning whether they had really understood David's business as well as they thought they had. "Maybe we should have talked to David more about how his company actually worked," Patricia suggested nervously. "I mean, we all assumed he was running everything himself. But if Sarah was doing technical work we didn't know about, maybe this case isn't as straightforward as we thought." Meanwhile, Sarah's demeanor was changing as she became more involved in reviewing the evidence Maria had compiled. The quiet, overwhelmed widow who had appeared so helpless during the early weeks of the lawsuit was being replaced by someone more confident and engaged in her own legal defense. During depositions, Sarah began providing detailed technical explanations that demonstrated her deep understanding of construction engineering principles. When Whitfield attempted to question her qualifications, she responded with the kind of precise, technical language that only someone with advanced engineering training could command effectively. Sarah's growing confidence was most evident when she reviewed the project files that documented her contributions to Pinnacle's success. As she walked Maria through the technical details of various construction challenges, her expertise became undeniable. This wasn't someone who had been peripherally involved in her husband's business. This was clearly the technical mastermind behind the company's most important achievements. The contrast between Sarah's actual capabilities and the Blackwood family's assumptions about her background was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard and Margaret had built their entire legal strategy around the idea that Sarah was an unqualified gold digger who had manipulated David for financial gain. The evidence was revealing someone who had been more qualified to run Pinnacle Construction than David himself had ever been. Whitfield privately advised Richard and Margaret that their case was falling apart, though he was careful not to admit how badly he had misjudged the situation when they first hired him. The evidence suggests that your assumptions about the business relationship between David and Sarah may not have been accurate, he said diplomatically during a tense conference call. What do you mean our assumptions weren't accurate? Richard demanded, his voice rising with frustration. Whitfield chose his words carefully, aware that his professional reputation was now at stake along with his client's legal position. It appears that Sarah's contributions to Pinnacle Construction were more substantial than any of us initially realized. Her technical background and financial involvement in the business create significant complications for our position that she was merely a dependent spouse. Margaret's voice was shrill with panic as she pressed their attorney for clearer answers. Are you telling us we can't win this case? Whitfield's response was a masterpiece of legal hedging designed to protect himself while preparing his clients for the inevitable outcome. I'm telling you that the evidence has developed in ways that make our original legal theory much more difficult to sustain. We need to seriously consider whether continuing this litigation serves your interests, especially given the potential for counterclaims and fee shifting if the court finds our case was frivolously brought. The Blackwood family was beginning to realize that their confident challenge to Sarah's inheritance had been based on a complete misunderstanding of how David's business had actually operated. Their public statements about his genius and their own qualifications to inherit his legacy were about to be measured against documentation that told a very different story about who had really built Pinnacle Construction into a $50 million enterprise. The courtroom was packed as Maria Rodriguez began presenting her expert witnesses, each testimony systematically dismantling the carefully constructed mythology that Richard and Margaret had built around David's supposed business genius. The first witness was Dr. James Patterson, a leading construction engineering consultant who had worked on projects alongside Pinnacle Construction for over a decade. Dr. Patterson settled into the witness chair with the confidence of someone who had testified in dozens of construction disputes, his gray beard and wire-rimmed glasses giving him the appearance of the academic expert he was. Under Maria's questioning, he began describing his professional interactions with Pinnacle Construction during the company's most successful years. I worked with Pinnacle on 17 major projects between 2011 and 2023, Dr. Patterson testified, consulting his notes with practiced precision. In every case involving complex engineering challenges, my primary technical discussions were with Sarah Chun, not with David Blackwood. She consistently demonstrated the most sophisticated understanding of foundation engineering principles I've encountered in 30 years of consulting work. Maria guided him through specific examples, each one revealing the true source of Pinnacle's technical innovations. Can you describe the Morrison Tower project from 2018, Dr. Patterson? The witness straightened in his chair, clearly comfortable discussing technical details. Morrison Tower required foundation work in extremely challenging soil conditions, with high water table issues and unstable clay layers. The conventional approaches would have been prohibitively expensive and time-consuming. Sarah Chun developed an innovative hybrid foundation system that reduced costs by 30% while exceeding safety requirements. And who presented this innovative solution to the client? Maria asked, though she already knew the answer. David Blackwood made the client presentation, Dr. Patterson admitted. But the engineering analysis, the calculations, the technical specifications, all of that was clearly Sarah's work. David was very good at explaining technical concepts to non-engineers, but the actual engineering expertise came from Sarah. Thomas Whitfield attempted cross-examination, but his questions only reinforced the damage to his client's position. Did Mr. Blackwood ever demonstrate technical engineering knowledge during these projects? Dr. Patterson considered the question carefully before answering. David was knowledgeable about construction processes and project management. But when discussions turned to complex structural analysis or innovative engineering solutions, he consistently deferred to Sarah. That pattern was consistent across every project we worked on together. The next witness was Robert Chun, no relation to Sarah despite sharing her surname. Chun was the former president of the Regional Construction Industry Association, and his testimony focused on Pinnacle Construction's reputation within the professional community. Within our industry, Pinnacle was known for two things, Chun explained to the attentive courtroom. Exceptional client relations, which everyone attributed to David's personality and sales skills, and groundbreaking technical innovations that solved problems other companies couldn't handle. What many people didn't realize was that those technical breakthroughs were coming from Sarah. Maria pressed him for specific details about Sarah's professional reputation. How was Mrs. Chun regarded by other engineering professionals in the construction industry? Chun's answer was unequivocal. Among engineers, Sarah Chun was considered one of the most innovative foundation specialists in the region. Her solutions to complex soil and structural challenges were studied and copied by engineering firms throughout the state. Several of her techniques became industry standard practices that are still being used today. The testimony revealed that Sarah had been quietly recognized as a technical leader within the engineering community, even while the general public attributed Pinnacle's success to David's business acumen. Professional engineering journals had published articles describing her innovative approaches, though David's name had typically appeared as the credited author due to his role as company president. Frank Morrison, Pinnacle's longtime project supervisor, provided the most damaging testimony about the actual division of labor within the company. Morrison had worked for Pinnacle since its early years and had observed the internal dynamics that outsiders never saw. In the field, everyone knew that technical questions went to Sarah, Morrison testified, his weathered hands gesturing as he spoke. If we had a foundation problem, a structural concern, or needed to modify engineering specifications, David would always say check with Sarah first. She spent more time on construction sites than most engineers, making sure her designs were being implemented correctly. Maria guided Morrison through descriptions of specific projects, each example reinforcing the pattern of Sarah's technical leadership and David's reliance on her expertise. The testimony painted a picture of a company where the supposed genius owner was actually dependent on his wife's engineering knowledge for every significant technical decision. But Morrison's most damaging revelation concerned the source of Pinnacle's competitive advantages in the marketplace. Our biggest selling points were always cost savings through innovative engineering solutions, he explained. Sarah would figure out ways to achieve the same structural requirements using less expensive materials or faster construction methods. David was great at selling those advantages to clients, but the innovations themselves came from Sarah's engineering analysis. The pattern Morrison described completely contradicted the Blackwood family's narrative about David's singular business genius. According to Morrison's testimony, David had been essentially a highly effective salesman who was dependent on Sarah's technical expertise for the actual substance of what he was selling to clients. Maria's next witness was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, not the politician but a structural engineering professor at the State University who had consulted on several Pinnacle projects. Her testimony focused on the sophistication of Sarah's engineering approaches and their influence on industry practices. Sarah Chun's work on seismic-resistant foundation systems was genuinely groundbreaking, Dr. Warren testified, her academic credentials lending weight to every word. Her hybrid approach to foundation design has been adopted by engineering firms across the western United States. I've used her techniques as case studies in my graduate engineering courses. This revelation was particularly damaging to the Blackwood family's position because it demonstrated that Sarah's contributions to Pinnacle extended far beyond routine engineering support. She had been developing innovative techniques that influenced the entire construction industry, innovations that were being taught to the next generation of engineers at major universities. Thomas Whitfield's cross-examination attempts became increasingly desperate as witness after witness confirmed Sarah's central role in Pinnacle's technical success. His questions began focusing on David's business management skills, apparently hoping to salvage some aspect of the Blackwood family's claims about their brother's irreplaceable contributions. But even this strategy backfired when Dr. Warren was asked about David's business capabilities. Mr. Blackwood was certainly skilled at client relations and project coordination, she acknowledged diplomatically. However, The strategic business decisions that drove Pinnacle's growth were clearly informed by Sarah's technical insights about market opportunities and competitive advantages. The final expert witness was Maria's masterstroke, someone whose testimony would completely demolish any remaining credibility for the Blackwood family's position. Dr. Michael Foster was a forensic accountant who had analyzed Pinnacle's financial records and business development patterns over its entire operational history. Dr. Foster's analysis revealed that Pinnacle's most profitable projects were invariably those where Sarah's engineering innovations provided the greatest competitive advantages. The correlation between her technical contributions and the company's financial success was mathematically demonstrable, with profit margins consistently highest on projects that required her most sophisticated engineering solutions. Moreover, Dr. Foster had traced the relationship between Sarah's personal investments and Pinnacle's business expansion. Every major growth phase in the company's development had been funded by profits from Sarah's technology investments, not by earnings from David's business activities. The pattern suggested a business that was entirely dependent on Sarah's financial resources and technical expertise for its continued success. As Dr. Foster concluded his testimony, Richard and Margaret sat in stunned silence, finally beginning to comprehend how completely they had misunderstood their brother's business and their sister-in-law's role in its success. The confident narrative they had constructed about David's genius and Sarah's peripheral involvement was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence and expert analysis. Thomas Whitfield made one final attempt to salvage his client's position by calling character witnesses who could speak to David's business reputation and family values. But even these friendly witnesses inadvertently reinforced the case against the Blackwood claims. When asked to describe David's greatest business strengths, witness after witness praised his ability to understand and communicate complex technical concepts to clients. However, when pressed for details about the source of those technical concepts, every witness acknowledged that David frequently mentioned consulting with Sarah on engineering matters. The cumulative effect of the expert testimony was devastating for Richard and Margaret's position. Their lawsuit had been premised on the idea that David was a singular business genius whose success represented Blackwood family achievements, while Sarah was merely a dependent spouse who had contributed nothing meaningful to the company's development. The evidence presented through expert witnesses told a completely different story. Sarah had been the technical mastermind behind Pinnacle's success, the primary financial backer of its operations, and the innovator whose engineering expertise had created the competitive advantages that drove the company's profitability. David had been a skilled salesman and project manager, but his contributions were entirely dependent on Sarah's technical and financial support. As the expert testimony phase concluded, it was clear that the Blackwood family's understanding of David's business had been based entirely on mythology rather than facts. Their confident legal challenge was about to collide with a judge's interpretation of evidence that completely contradicted every assumption they had made about their brother's achievements and their own entitlement to his legacy. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered the courtroom with the measured stride of someone who had presided over hundreds of probate disputes. But the packed gallery and media presence indicated this case had attracted unusual public attention. The Blackwood family lawsuit had become a symbol of entitled relatives challenging grieving spouses, and the community was eager to see how justice would be served. Richard and Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table with Thomas Whitfield, their earlier confidence replaced by barely concealed panic as they awaited the judge's ruling. 3 months of devastating evidence had systematically destroyed every assumption they had made about David's business genius and Sarah's peripheral role in Pinnacle Construction's success. Sarah sat beside Maria Rodriguez with a calm dignity that had grown stronger throughout the legal proceedings. The terrified widow who had been blindsided by the initial lawsuit had been replaced by a woman who understood exactly how much she had contributed to building the empire that others were trying to steal from her. Judge Hendricks settled into her chair and opened the thick file containing months of evidence, expert testimony, and legal arguments. Her expression was stern as she began speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. This case presents a cautionary tale about the dangers of making assumptions without examining evidence. Judge Hendricks began, her gaze moving deliberately between the opposing legal teams. The plaintiffs have challenged the validity of David Blackwood's will based on claims that his wife Sarah Chun was unfit to inherit his construction business due to alleged lack of qualifications, foreign origins, and manipulative behavior designed to exploit a vulnerable widower. The judge paused, allowing the weight of the accusations to settle over the courtroom before continuing. However, the evidence presented during these proceedings tells a dramatically different story about the relationship between David Blackwood and Sarah Chun, and about the true origins of Pinnacle Construction's remarkable success. Richard's hands clenched involuntarily as Judge Hendricks began systematically reviewing the evidence that had demolished their case. The court has heard extensive testimony from industry experts, former employees, and financial analysts about the actual operations of Pinnacle Construction and the respective contributions of David Blackwood and Sarah Chun to the company's development. The financial evidence alone completely contradicts the plaintiff's narrative, the judge continued, consulting her notes with practiced precision. Far from being a dependent spouse seeking to exploit David Blackwood's wealth, Sarah Chun provided 100% of the initial capital that launched Pinnacle Construction. She personally guaranteed the business loans that funded the company's expansion, using her excellent credit and substantial personal assets to secure financing that David Blackwood could not have obtained independently. Margaret's face had gone white as the judge methodically destroyed their carefully constructed mythology about David's self-made success. The court finds that David Blackwood contributed no personal funds to the establishment or operation of Pinnacle Construction, and that his previous entrepreneurial attempts had left him financially unable to qualify for business credit without Sarah Chun's backing. But Judge Hendricks was just getting started with her devastating analysis of the evidence. The technical testimony has been even more damaging to the plaintiff's position, she declared, her voice taking on an edge that suggested professional outrage at the frivolous nature of the lawsuit. The plaintiffs argued that Sarah Chun lacked the qualifications to manage a complex construction business, apparently unaware that she holds a PhD in civil engineering from one of Taiwan's most prestigious universities. The evidence shows that her doctoral research on earthquake-resistant foundation systems directly contributed to Pinnacle Construction's competitive advantages in the marketplace. Richard slumped in his chair as the judge continued reading from Sarah's impressive academic credentials. More significantly, every expert witness testified that Sarah Chun, not David Blackwood, was responsible for the technical innovations that established Pinnacle's reputation for solving complex engineering challenges. The court has reviewed project files documenting hundreds of pages of sophisticated engineering analysis written in Sarah Chun's hand, leading to simplified client presentations bearing David Blackwood's signature. The courtroom gallery began murmuring as the full scope of the Blackwood family's delusions became clear through the judge's recitation of facts. Judge Hendricks called for silence before delivering what amounted to a professional humiliation of the plaintiff's position. The pattern revealed by this evidence suggests that David Blackwood functioned primarily as a salesman and project coordinator, while Sarah Chun provided the engineering expertise, financial resources, and technical innovation that actually created value for Pinnacle Construction's clients. Far from being an unqualified dependent, Sarah Chun was the intellectual and financial foundation upon which the entire business was built. Thomas Whitfield looked physically ill as Judge Hendricks turned her attention to the legal implications of the evidence. The plaintiff's claims of undue influence and manipulative behavior appear to be complete projections of their own assumptions rather than factual allegations supported by evidence. The suggestion that Sarah Chun married David Blackwood for financial gain is particularly ironic, given that she possessed greater personal wealth and professional qualifications than her husband at the time of their marriage. The judge's tone grew sharper as she addressed the most offensive aspects of the lawsuit. The court finds the plaintiff's characterization of Sarah Chun as a gold-digging foreigner to be both factually baseless and deeply troubling in its xenophobic implications. This characterization becomes even more objectionable when measured against evidence showing that Sarah Chun's contributions to the marriage and the business far exceeded those of David Blackwood himself. Margaret began crying softly as the full magnitude of their mistake became undeniable through the judge's systematic destruction of their position. The family's public statements about David's genius and their own understanding of his business success were being revealed as complete fantasies that had no relationship to documented reality. Judge Hendricks moved on to the question of the plaintiffs standing to challenge the will in the first place. The evidence demonstrates that the plaintiffs fundamentally misunderstood the nature and origins of David Blackwood's business success. Their claims of family contribution to Pinnacle Construction are unsupported by any documentary evidence, while their assumptions about David's individual achievements have been thoroughly contradicted by expert testimony and business records. The judge's next comments addressed the broader implications of the case for future probate disputes. This lawsuit appears to have been filed based entirely on assumptions and wishful thinking rather than factual investigation. The plaintiffs made no effort to examine the actual operations of Pinnacle Construction or to understand Sarah Chen's role in the business before filing claims that have proven to be completely without merit. Richard and Margaret exchanged desperate glances as Judge Hendricks approached her final ruling. The court hereby dismisses all claims brought by the plaintiffs against David Blackwood's will and against Sarah Chen's inheritance of Pinnacle Construction. Furthermore, the court finds that this lawsuit was filed without reasonable basis in fact or law, making it appropriate to award attorneys' fees and costs to the defendant. The gallery erupted in applause as Sarah's vindication became official, but Judge Hendricks wasn't finished delivering consequences for the frivolous lawsuit. The court orders the plaintiffs to pay Sarah Chen's legal fees and costs in the amount of $437,000. Representing the expenses she incurred defending against these baseless accusations. Thomas Whitfield's professional reputation was taking a devastating hit as Judge Hendricks concluded with comments clearly directed at his decision to file such a poorly researched lawsuit. The court expects attorneys to conduct basic due diligence before filing cases that make serious accusations against grieving widows. The failure to investigate the actual facts underlying this dispute reflects poorly on the legal profession and has caused unnecessary trauma to someone who was already dealing with the loss of her spouse. As Judge Hendricks left the bench, the courtroom dissolved into chaos. Reporters rushed towards Sarah for comments, while Richard and Margaret sat in stunned silence, finally comprehending how completely they had misunderstood their brother's life and achievements. Maria Rodriguez guided Sarah through the media scrum, but Sarah paused to address the cameras with a statement she had prepared for this moment. David was a wonderful husband and a good man who understood that our marriage was a true partnership, she said, her voice steady and clear. He supported my contributions to our business just as I supported his, and I believe he would be proud to know that the truth about our partnership has finally been recognized. The media coverage of the ruling was brutal for the Blackwood family's reputation. Headlines across the region described their humiliating defeat and their stunning ignorance about David's actual business operations. The family members who had enthusiastically supported the lawsuit during its early stages now distanced themselves from Richard and Margaret, claiming they had been misled about the strength of the case. Thomas Whitfield faced professional sanctions from the State Bar Association for filing a frivolous lawsuit without adequate investigation. His expensive downtown law firm quietly encouraged him to take early retirement rather than face the continued embarrassment of being associated with such a spectacular legal failure. But the most satisfying aspect of Sarah's vindication was what happened to Pinnacle Construction under her open leadership. Within 6 months of the court ruling, Sarah had leveraged her Taiwan technology connections to expand Pinnacle into international markets, using her engineering expertise and cultural knowledge to secure major projects throughout Asia. The company's revenue doubled in the first year after Sarah took public credit for her technical contributions, as clients who had previously been unaware of her role began specifically requesting her engineering expertise for their most challenging projects. International engineering firms began competing to partner with Pinnacle, attracted by Sarah's reputation for innovative foundation solutions and her connections in the rapidly growing Asian construction market. Sarah established the David Blackwood Memorial Foundation, using a portion of Pinnacle's expanded profits to provide engineering scholarships for immigrant students. The foundation's mission statement specifically honored David's memory while ensuring that future generations of foreign-born engineers would receive the recognition and support that Sarah had been denied during her marriage. Richard and Margaret found themselves completely isolated from the business empire they had tried to claim, with no legal standing to demand information about Pinnacle's operations and no social standing to approach Sarah for reconciliation after their vicious legal assault. Their public statements during the lawsuit had burned every bridge with the sister-in-law, whose forgiveness they would have needed to maintain any connection to David's legacy. The final irony came when Sarah's expansion of Pinnacle into international markets made her one of the most prominent Asian American business leaders in the region, exactly the kind of success story that David had worried might threaten their business if clients knew about her background. Instead, her visibility as an accomplished immigrant entrepreneur attracted new clients who specifically wanted to work with someone who understood both American and Asian construction markets. Richard and Margaret's attempt to steal Sarah's inheritance had instead resulted in her achieving recognition as the engineering genius she had always been, while their own reputations were permanently tarnished by their public display of greed, racism, and stunning ignorance about their own family members' achievements. As Sarah stood in her expanded offices 2 years after the court ruling, looking out at construction sites across the city where Pinnacle crews were implementing her innovative engineering solutions, she felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond financial success. The truth about her partnership with David had finally been recognized, and the business they had built together was flourishing under her undivided leadership. The Blackwood family's attempt at revenge had backfired completely, transforming Sarah from a grieving widow into a celebrated business leader while exposing their own incompetence and entitlement for the entire community to see. Justice had been served with interest, and Sarah Chun had finally received the recognition she had always deserved. Has a story like this ever resonated with your own family dynamics or workplace experiences? Whether you're an immigrant professional, someone who's been underestimated, or just someone who believes in justice being served, I'd love to hear your thoughts about Sarah's journey from hidden genius to recognized leader. Share your reaction in the comments below, and let me know which part of this story hit closest to home for you.